Camping solo in Northeast Ohio was supposed to be a challenge to myself. 3 days in the woods, no company, no distractions, just me, a hammock, and the sound of the wind through the trees. It was my final night, and so far things had gone smoothly. The woods had been quiet except for the occasional rustle of small critters. I felt accomplished, maybe even a bit cocky, thinking I'd conquered solitude. That confidence would disappear before the night was over. Around 2 a.m., I woke up needing to relieve myself. I crawled out of my hammock, grabbed my boots, and wandered a few steps away into the dark. The moonlight filtered through the trees, giving me just enough visibility. As I stood there, I caught a faint glimmer of light about 80 feet away, a headlamp. At first, I thought it was just another camper. It's not unheard of to run into people in these woods, but I hadn't seen anyone for 3 days. I watched the light sway slightly, then settle as whoever it was sat down. My gut told me to stay still and observe. For 10 minutes, I watched the beam move sporadically. The figure stood up, shifted, and sat back down again. It felt odd. Why would anyone be hanging out in the woods at this hour, not far from my camp, without making themselves known? I slid my boots on properly and grabbed my hatchet, keeping my movements deliberate and quiet. If someone was out here messing around, I wanted answers. Circling wide to the right of my campsite, I crept through the brush, keeping my eyes on the light. As I got closer, another headlamp blinked into view, this one much closer, maybe 40 feet away. My stomach knotted. 2 people? I dropped to the ground, pulling leaves over myself for cover. The second figure walked toward me, his steps heavy on the underbrush. He stopped no more than 10 feet from where I was lying. My heart thudded in my chest as he pulled out a lighter, flicked it, and lit a cigarette. The faint glow lit up his face, a scruffy man, eyes sunken, lips chapped. He swigged from a beer can before tossing it carelessly to the ground. I held my breath, counting the seconds until he moved on. When he finally trudged away, I waited until I was sure he couldn't hear me before crawling forward again. The first headlamp was still there, stationary now. I crept closer, my steps silent on the damp ground. I was within 20 feet when I heard it, a faint buzz, then the distinct ding of a phone receiving a message. The light from his screen illuminated his face as he read the text. He looked rugged, his clothes dirty and torn. Suddenly he stood and started walking toward my campsite. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I waited until he disappeared into the trees before doubling back. I kept low, moving as quickly as I dared, until I could hear the faint rustling of tarps and the metallic clink of my mess kit. Then voices, low, muttering but distinct. "Where the hell is he?" one of them said. "He was just here," another replied. I edged closer, just enough to see the beams of their flashlights sweeping through my camp. One of them grabbed my big flashlight, flicking it on and off as if mocking me. Then I heard the sound of ripping fabric. My tarp. They were tearing my campsite apart. I stayed low, watching as they stomped through the area. My mess kit hit the ground with a clatter, and one of them laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the trees. I stayed frozen until their lights began to fade, retreating into the forest. Only when I was certain they were gone did I stand and cautiously make my way back to the wreckage. The sun was just beginning to rise when I returned to my camp. What I saw made my chest tighten. My hammock and tarp were shredded, long gashes in the material that looked like they'd been made with a machete. My mess kit was crushed, dented beyond use. My backpack, rain gear, and flashlight were gone, stolen. I retraced my steps to where I'd seen the first man. The ground was littered with empty beer cans, a few discarded chewing tobacco pouches, and a spent lighter. Moving to where the second man had been, I found an empty plastic bag dusted with a white powder that I guessed was meth. Cigarette butts were scattered everywhere. I packed up what little remained of my gear and left the woods as quickly as I could, every rustle in the trees making me jump. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, but relieved to be out of there. That night, as I sat in my apartment trying to process what had happened, one thought kept circling back in my mind. Those men weren't out there by accident. They had a purpose, and I was just lucky to get away before I found out what it was. Camping in the mountains was always the highlight of our summer. a chance to escape the noise of everyday life and settle into the quiet rhythm of nature. The spot we'd chosen had become a tradition for my partner and me, a little slice of wilderness known only to a few. It was remote, peaceful, and perfect. This past weekend, we packed up the truck, grabbed the usual gear, and even brought along my parents' small, elderly dog. Every year, the little guy loved exploring the woods with us, happy to amble around camp and nap by the fire. When we arrived, the mountain was eerily empty. Usually we'd come across a stray hunter or a lone fisherman somewhere along the way, but this time, there was no one. Not a single truck parked, no signs of campsites in use, nothing. The place was completely deserted. It struck me as strange, but I brushed it off. People don't always go where you expect, and we had the whole mountain to ourselves. We scoped out the area, set up camp, and spent the evening unwinding by the fire, our pup curled up nearby. The quiet settled in quickly as the sun dipped below the horizon. The absence of other campers added a certain tranquility, or so I thought. When we decided to call it a night, the dog started acting off. Normally he was content to curl up in the tent and snooze, but not this time. He paced back and forth, whining softly, his ears twitching at the slightest noise. We had the tent unzipped, with just the mesh between us and the outside air. He sat at the opening, staring out into the dark, nose twitching as if he'd caught a scent. We stepped out to see what had him so focused, scanning the tree line with our flashlights. There was nothing out there, at least nothing we could see. I was about to chalk it up to a squirrel or rabbit when he started growling, low and guttural. It was the kind of sound I'd never heard from him before, and it sent a chill up my spine. We decided to stay up for a bit longer by the fire, thinking maybe the light and our presence would deter whatever was spooking him. But the longer we sat, the worse his behavior got. His hackles were up, his growls deepened, and his gaze fixed on one direction in the woods. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't normal. I grabbed the hunting knife and axe we'd brought along, my hand tightening on the handle as I tried to convince myself it was nothing, a raccoon or maybe a stray deer. But the tension in the air said otherwise. The woods around us were too quiet, like every living thing had gone still. The firelight flickered weakly against the encroaching darkness, and every snap of a twig sent my heart pounding. The dog suddenly barked, loud and sharp, spinning toward the same spot in the woods he'd been growling at. My pulse thundered in my ears as I strained to hear something, anything, that would explain his outburst. Then the unmistakable crack of a tree branch snapped through the silence. It was close, too close, maybe 10 feet away. We froze. Whatever it was had been watching us, stalking us silently until now. The crack was deliberate, like a warning, or worse, a signal. My partner grabbed the dog, and we bolted for the truck, slamming the doors shut and locking them. We sat there, adrenaline coursing through our veins, straining to see through the darkness. For 30 agonizing minutes, we waited. The dog's ears were perked, but he eventually settled, his growls tapering off. My partner suggested cautiously that maybe it was just a cougar or wolves, something passing through. They'd move on. They always did. Against my better judgment, we returned to the fire, trying to regain some sense of normalcy. But it didn't last. The dog's hackles went up again, and this time, we didn't need his warning. From the same direction as before came another sound. Not a snap this time, but the crunch of leaves under deliberate steps, slow, heavy. The firelight barely illuminated the edge of the woods, and I couldn't see anything beyond the dancing shadows. My mind raced. Wolves, a cougar, or something worse. My breath caught as a low, guttural growl, much too deep to be the dog's, echoed from the darkness. We didn't wait this time. Grabbing what little we could, we scrambled back to the truck and slammed the doors. The dog whined and scratched at the window, but neither of us dared step outside again. For another hour, we sat there, hearts hammering, watching the shadows twist and shift just beyond the headlights. When we finally worked up the nerve to drive away, we left everything but the essentials behind. Later, as we drove back down the mountain, I couldn't shake the thought that if we hadn't brought the dog, we might not have been here to tell this story. Whatever was out there had been stalking us, biding its time, and without his warnings, we would have never seen it coming. Before we dive into the next story, if you're new here, Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support means the world to us. Thanks for watching. It was the last weekend of summer, and my friends and I wanted to do something memorable before school started. We were a group of 4. Me, Danny, Josh, and Sarah. We were all 16 and thought we could handle a night out in the woods on our own. Danny's older brother had lent us some camping gear, and we picked a spot in the forest a few miles from town. It wasn't too far, but far enough to feel like an adventure. The day started off great. We set up our tents, started a small fire, and roasted marshmallows while joking around. The forest was quiet, except for the sound of birds and the rustle of leaves in the wind. It felt peaceful. Later, as the sun began to set, we decided to gather more firewood. Josh and I wandered a little further from the camp, while Sarah and Danny stayed back. That's when we saw them. About 50 yards away, 3 men stood among the trees. They wore camouflage clothes, the kind hunters might wear, but something felt off. They weren't carrying rifles or bows. Instead, they just stood there, almost like they were watching us. I nudged Josh and whispered, "Hey, do you see that?" "Yeah," he said quietly, his voice shaky, "but let's just grab the wood and go back." We kept glancing at them as we hurried to pick up sticks. They didn't move, didn't wave, didn't say anything, just stood there. I tried to tell myself they were hunters or hikers, but hunting wasn't even allowed in this area. When we got back to camp, I told Danny and Sarah what we saw. Danny laughed it off. "Probably just some weirdos," he said. "No big deal." Sarah seemed uneasy though, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Night fell, and we sat around the fire trying to keep the mood light. We told ghost stories and dared each other to wander into the woods alone. But even then, I kept thinking about those men. Were they still out there? Eventually, we went to bed. The night was quiet, except for the usual forest sounds, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the rustling of leaves. I was in a tent with Josh, and we talked quietly for a while before drifting off. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't hurried or heavy, but light and uneven, like someone trying to tread softly but failing to hide their presence. The crunch of leaves and snapping of small twigs sounded far too close. My breath caught in my throat as I strained to listen. The footsteps weren't coming in a straight line. They weaved and circled around the tents, moving unpredictably. Whoever was out there wasn't in a rush, but they were definitely moving with purpose. I nudged Josh, but he didn't wake up. "Josh," I whispered, barely able to get the word out. He mumbled something, still half asleep, and turned over. I lay frozen, my ears glued to the sound. The steps were so close now, I could almost feel them through the ground. Suddenly, they stopped right next to our tent. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tense. I could hear breathing outside, shallow, rough, and uneven. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might shake the tent. Then the footsteps started again, this time moving toward Danny and Sarah's tent. They shuffled, paused, shuffled again. Whoever it was, they weren't just passing through. I wanted to yell, to grab a flashlight, anything, but I couldn't move. Fear locked me in place, and I just lay there, listening as the sounds circled us again and again. After what felt like hours, the footsteps slowly faded into the distance. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, my thoughts buzzing with dread. Every noise felt like it was dragging me back into that moment, as if they might return at any second. When morning finally came, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted. The ground around the tents was covered in footprints. They weren't ours. They were larger, heavier, and circled the campsite in strange, looping patterns. We packed up and left as fast as we could. None of us talked much on the way back. Sarah looked pale, and even Danny, who always acted tough, was unusually quiet. I still don't know who those men were or what they were doing out there, but one thing's for sure, it was spooky as hell, and it's something I'll never forget. Rock Island, Wisconsin wasn't the kind of place you stumbled upon by accident. Nestled beyond 2 ferry rides, one to Washington Island and another to the even more remote Rock Island, it was a destination that required intention. The isolation was part of its charm. No vehicles, no electricity, just an untouched wilderness with a reputation steeped in history and mystery. For years, my husband and I had heard whispers of its beauty and eerie solitude, so we finally decided to experience it ourselves one summer. The journey there felt like peeling away the layers of the modern world. Each ferry ride was another step back in time, leaving behind the hum of civilization. By the time we reached Rock Island, it was just us, our gear, and the whispers of the past, literally. The island was home to ruins of early settlers, 3 cemeteries, and a palpable sense of something lingering in the air. The day passed like a dream. We explored the crumbling stone buildings, wandered through the shaded trails, and marveled at the untouched shoreline. As night fell, the stars began to glimmer in a way you could only see from a place as remote as this. The sky seemed to stretch endlessly, each pinprick of light sharper and brighter than we'd ever seen. It was too beautiful to miss, so my husband suggested we head to a nearby field known for its unobstructed view of the sky. The field was about a quarter mile from our campsite, but there was one catch. It required walking past one of the cemeteries. Normally, I wasn't one to spook easily, but something about the island's atmosphere had me on edge. Maybe it was the unsettling silence, or the way the shadows seemed to stretch a little too long under the faint glow of our lantern. Still, I didn't want to be the one to ruin the night, so I agreed. The walk started uneventfully. The gravel crunched under our boots, and the only sounds were the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant lapping of water. As we neared the cemetery, though, a thick fog began to roll in, seemingly out of nowhere. One moment, the air was crisp and clear, and the next, it was as though the world was dissolving into mist. "Did you check the forecast?" I asked, trying to mask the unease in my voice. "It's just fog," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. The fog wrapped around us like a blanket, muting the world and reducing our lantern's glow to a dim halo. I tightened my grip on my husband's arm as we pressed on, the cemetery now just a dark smudge to our left. That's when I saw them. 2 glowing orbs, low to the ground, fixed in the distance like twin embers. I stopped dead in my tracks. "Do you see that?" I whispered, my mouth suddenly dry. My husband followed my gaze and flicked his flashlight toward the orbs. The beam of light cut through the fog but didn't reveal anything concrete. The orbs didn't move. They just blinked slowly. "Probably an animal," he muttered, but his voice wasn't as steady as I'd have liked. Before I could respond, more appeared. 3, 4, then 5 sets of glowing eyes, all staring back at us. My breath hitched and every instinct screamed at me to run. "Let's go," I said, pulling at his arm. We turned and started walking quickly back the way we came, but the fog seemed thicker now, clinging to us, muffling the sound of our footsteps. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, those glowing eyes boring into our backs. Then, from somewhere behind us, a faint rustling broke the silence. "Don't look back," I whispered, though I was already glancing over my shoulder. The glowing eyes were gone, or maybe they'd moved. The shadows felt alive, shifting and swaying just beyond the lantern's reach. When the rustling turned to distinct crunching footsteps, we broke into a full sprint. My lungs burned, and the cold, damp air stung my throat, but I didn't dare slow down. Every snap of a twig or shift of the fog made my heart pound harder. By the time we burst into the clearing near our campsite, we were both gasping for breath, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lantern. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, though I wasn't sure I wanted an answer. My husband didn't reply. He was staring back toward the trail, the flashlight in his hand trembling slightly. The fog seemed to stop just short of our campsite, as if held back by some invisible barrier. For a long moment, neither of us moved, straining to hear or see anything in the oppressive silence. Finally, the fog began to lift, and with it, the tension in the air seemed to ease. We sat by the fire, our nerves still raw, and tried to laugh it off. "Probably deer," he said eventually, though we both knew deer didn't have glowing eyes like that. The next morning, as we packed up to leave, a ranger stopped by our site for a routine check. My husband mentioned the glowing eyes in the fog, and the ranger chuckled. "Oh, that's just the foxes," he said. "The island's full of them. They're curious critters, especially at night. Probably just came by to see who was in their territory." Foxes. Of course, it made sense, logical, harmless, even cute. And yet, I couldn't shake the unease that had wrapped around me the night before. Something about the fog, the eyes, the oppressive silence felt wrong. If it hadn't been for the foxes, or whatever it was, I don't think we would have turned back when we did. And if we hadn't turned back, I'm not sure we'd be here to tell the story.